Hey, welcome back. In this video, I'll be showing you guys how to build this full stack application that lets us keep track of our expenses. The application will let us create, edit, or delete an expense. And to build this application, we'll be using React, Redux, .NET Core, SQL Server, Entity Framework, and a few other things. This is the front end part, so we'll be using React and Redux on this video. We'll leave almost everything set up to call our API later on. So that's actually the next part. Will be setting up our database and creating our web API. The final part will be integrating between the web API and our front end. Make sure we have the full application. This will be really good practice for those of you who want to learn more about building full stack applications. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you don't miss any other videos. And I'm really excited to show you guys this application. So if you're ready, let's get started. Pull up your browser and head over to redux.js.org/introduction/getting started. And we're going to be using this create a React Redux app template. So copy this, head back to your computer and pick whichever location you want your project to live and paste that command in there. And before you hit enter, let's rename this to expenses.frontend. And now hit enter. So once it's finished, as you can see, it says success. And now let's go inside that directory. So cd into expenses.frontend, and I hit tab to autocomplete. And now we can do npm start. And you should see this page generated by the template. So we're going to be using React Bootstrap. So head over to reactbootstrap.github.io/getting started/introduction. That was long. All right, installation. So copy this command and let's go back to your console and paste that. Back at the console, you can hit Ctrl+C to stop the application from running and paste that in and hit enter. Once it finishes, you should see some output like this. Now let's open our application. So I'm currently in expenses.frontend directory and I'm gonna do code dot, and this is going to open Visual Studio Code in this location. This is the editor I'm gonna be using. Feel free to use whichever editor you want. Okay, so this open Visual Studio Code, and what we want to do is clean some of this stuff up. So let's go ahead and let's delete pretty much all this stuff. We don't need this. We'll say hello there. Let's get rid of all this stuff. We don't need it for now. Let's go to store. Let's clean this up. Let's clean this up. And let's delete all of this stuff. Delete. And then we can rename features to components. Components. Back to our browser, there's one more thing we got to do to have React Bootstrap working, and is importing this style sheets. So let's copy this and head back to our index.js and import this. Okay, so let's open index.js and just paste that in there. So now if we run the application, so we can hit, if you're using Visual Studio Code, you can go to terminal, new terminal, and right here you can do npm start. Take a second or two, and we should see our application running with hello there. Okay, so now we're ready to start writing our program. And one of the first things I like to think about is where's the data living and what do we need in our global state, right? So as of right now, the only thing I can think of that we should be putting in the global state would be the expenses themselves. Everything else should be local to our components. We should not put a lot of stuff in the global state or stuff that we don't need in there, because it gets really cluttered and that's not the purpose of it, right? So we're going to put expenses in our global state, and then expenses are going to be living in a database somewhere, right? So meaning we'll have to make an HTTP request to get those expenses. As of right now, we don't have a database set up or a web API set up, but what we can do is pretend that we're making that call and we're getting that response, right? We're getting all those expenses. That way we just have, our ground laid up so that whenever we do, we just need to make the request and make the thing happen. With that said, let's right click on source and create a new folder directory called services. And inside services, we're going to create a new file called expenses. And this file is going to be responsible of basically making our HTTP requests. So this is what we're going to be using to get all the expenses, creating new expenses, and whatnot, right? Like reaching out to our web API. So let's do export const get expenses, and this will be an asynchronous method, and we're going to be passing a dispatch, and I'll say in a minute why. All right, and then in here we'll have a try and catch, and if there's an error, we're just going to log error, and then up here is where we're going to make our API call. So for now, we're just going to fake the API call as if like we're getting a response. So we're just going to have a hard-coded response. So it will be expenses equals to, let's have an array, and then this array will have objects which has an ID, a description, say groceries, and an amount. All right, let's do a couple more. So this will be 2 and 3, and this could be like gas. This could be like student loans, and say we do, and this is like $600 or something. So this object right here is the mock, or the us faking the response of our API call. So we're passing in a dispatch which we're not currently using, but for those of you that don't know, dispatch is a function of the Redux store, and a dispatch is used to trigger, as a way to trigger a state change. So we dispatch an action, and that means something happened and our state changes. And we're going to be using this to basically store the expenses return out of our API call. So basically all of these expenses, this array is going to be stored in our state once we dispatch that action. That said, what we need to do next is create our reducer, which is just a function that determines the changes to our application state, and it uses the actions it receives in order to accomplish that, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's right click on app and add a new file, and we're going to call the file expenses reducer.js. And some people, this is personal preference. Some people like to split their actions and the reducer into different files. I personally like to put them together. I think it's more compact, and it's just a little easier to find things and just look through the code. But feel free to do whichever way you prefer. Let's start off by typing our initial state. So it's const initial state, and then this is just going to be an expenses array. Next, let's define our action types. Let's call it set expenses, set expenses. Now let's define our action creators. And we're going to call it set expenses, and this is going to take a payload, and it's going to be of type action types dot set expenses. There you go. And we're going to pass payload. Okay, and then you can do Alt Shift F and it should auto format your code. Now on to our reducer, we want to do export default, and we're going to pass in state. Initially it's going to be equals to the initial state, and we're going to pass in an action. So we're going to do a switch, and we're going to switch the action type. And depending on the action type, we're going to do different things. So in the case of set expense, let's do case action types that set expenses. We're going to return an object. I'll explain in a second what this means. Expenses, payload, and Alt Shift F to reformat your code. So let's go over what we just wrote. So this is our reducer, and the reducer has a state and an action. So the action gets passed in, and depending on the type, it's going to do something about it. In this case, we only have set expenses. In the future, we're going to have like delete expense or edit expense and so forth. So if it enters this case, it's going to return this object. And this object has state. And this is called the spread operator. So basically, it's just going to return whatever is in state. And in addition, it's going to add expenses, or it's going to override expenses with this array. And this array is the action payload. And the payload is whatever we're passing in whenever we're dispatching that action. I hope this makes sense. And if it doesn't, just give it time. It will make sense. We're going to do more cases, so you'll get familiar with it. But for now, we're done with our reducer. So let's hit Control S and save the file and head back to our services file, expenses. And now we're ready to have our dispatch. So let's import the action creators from app/expenses reducer. And now since this is getting passed in, we just got to dispatch action creators dot set expenses, and we're going to pass in expenses. And save that file. At this point, we are getting all the expenses from the database. We're making the request, right? We're getting all the expenses, and we are dispatching an action, and we're setting all the expenses in the state. So this is a good point to create a component and making sure we retrieve those expenses from the state, and we display them to the user pretty much. So let's go ahead and right click components, and let's type in expenses. I'll say expense list.js. Let's import React and the use effect. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Effect from React. We would also need to import the use dispatch. Again, that's not what I meant to do. Use dispatch from React Redux. Format that. Okay. And now let's export default. And here we want to get the dispatch. Okay. So these are called hooks, and we're using this hook to get the dispatch we need in order to pass it to our services so that they can dispatch any of the actions, right? And then we also need to use the use effect, which is another hook. And the use effect takes two arguments. There's a function first, and the second is an array of dependencies. Basically, what this means is this is going to run depending on whatever you specify here. Say if we put like some variable, it's going to run every time that variable changes. In the case that we want it right now, we only want it to run once because we want to retrieve all the expenses. We want to make the call to the API once at the beginning, right? So since we only want it to run once, we leave it blank. So we just leave it empty, just an empty array of dependencies. And here we're just going to call get expenses, and we're going to pass the dispatch. Notice that import get expenses from services/expenses got automatically imported for me. But if it didn't get automatically imported for you, be sure to import this. Let's return anything here. So we can say expense list. Save that file. Let's now head over to app and hook this up. Let's just delete this stuff. We don't need this. And okay. And what I like to do is, this is preference, but I like to do an error function here. And we don't need this curly brace. Just gonna do parentheses. Okay, so in here, we are going to do a div. And let's give it some style. Let's say the width is 60% and the margin, let's say auto, so it centers. Let's do an h3. This would be your expenses, and we're gonna do expense list. Cool. And then we can do import expense list from components / expense list. Save that file, and you can auto format as well. Before we head to our browser, let's go back to store and let's add our reducer. So expenses reducer, expenses reducer. There you go. And save that file. So if you do an npm start and head out to your browser, you're going to see that we're getting this error. And this error happens, I actually seen this before, is when we're missing the default state in the switch statement of the reducer. So let's head back and add that real quick. So we're here, let's do a default. I forgot to do this, and return state. Save that, back to your browser, and now you should see your expenses and expense list. If we check out the Redux DevTools, you should get this if you don't have it. It's really good for debugging. We can see the state and that we have an expense reducer, and this thing has expenses inside. It's an array, and it has all of our stuff. It has ID 1, 2, and 3. There you go, all of it. And then we can see the actions that got triggered. In this case, we only have one, set expenses. So cool, everything seems like it's working perfectly. Let's go back to app.js, and I have a typo right here, so I'm gonna fix that. And heading back to expense list, we are ready to display the list of expenses to the user. Since we already have it in our state, all we gotta do is show it. So let's do that. The first thing we wanna do is actually pull the expenses from the state. So for that, we're going to be using the use selector. And this is a hook that lets us retrieve the stuff we need from our state. In this case, we only want expenses, which is the only thing we have. So use selector, state that expenses reducer that expenses. There you go. So now we have the expenses. Next, let's iterate through expenses and use the map function. Expenses map. Okay. So enter here. All right, and here, let's do a div. And inside of here, we want to have some kind of margin just to make it look better. So I'm gonna add some margin at the bottom. Let's auto format that. And then in here, what we wanna do is create just some inner component to make it a little easier for us. So we can do list row, expenses, oops. Okay, and in here, we're just gonna return a div. And the div will have a row, since we want a row per expense itself. And then we're gonna have a few columns. Let me copy this. We're actually gonna have a couple of columns. So the first one will be the expenses, not the expenses. My fault. The expense dot description. And the second one will have the expense that amount. And then inside of here, we'll have a button. So a button with a variant of warning to make it yellow or orange kind of thing. And then we can just close it here, say edit. And let's add a line down here to make it look a little better. We can do HR. All right, and now up here, let's call that list row and pass in expense is equals to E. Save that and make sure all this stuff gets imported. So let's go up here, say import button row column from React Bootstrap and save that. If you pull up your browser now, you'll see your expenses and the list of the expenses that we currently have. And you see this edit button right here. Right now it doesn't do anything. So this is really cool. This is really good progress. I think we should go ahead and try to add the top part now where you can just add a new expense so that you add it and it pops right here in the bottom. So let's do that next. So back to our code, let's create a component that is responsible for just displaying the form so that the user can create a new expense or it can edit an expense. That way we can reuse this component for either or. So let's go ahead and right click on components and add a new file here. It's going to be called expense form.js. And inside of here, we want to do the usual export default. And we're going to return a form. And the form will have different things. But for now, let's just do a row and column. And we'll have another set of columns, but let me do a form label inside of here so we can just copy and paste this label. And also it will have a form that control. Okay, let me copy this and paste it right next to it. Let's go ahead and add the button. So inside the row, we're going to have a div. And that div, we're going to give it some style. And I'm doing this in line styles because I'm lazy. So let's do margin, top, auto. Okay, now inside here, we have to choose which button to show. If we're going to show the add button to create a new expense, or the save, delete, or cancel editing an expense. So for that, we'll have to have some kind of variable to check that. I'm just going to call it is new expense. And we're going to do a ternary condition here. So if it's an expense, then we're just going to do the button variant equals to primary, type equals to submit, and we're going to do add. Let me copy this. If it's not a new expense, that means it's trying to edit an expense. I'm going to do a div. Okay, let me auto format that. And in here, we're going to have basically 3 buttons. One for delete, one for saving, so save, and another one for canceling. Let's do different colors for these. So for this one, let's do danger, make it red. This one will have success to make it green, and this one will be default. All right, and then the only one that needs to be an actual submit would be the save. The rest don't actually need it. All right, let's go up and make sure we are importing everything that we need. So form got automatically imported for me. I'm gonna add row, column, and in addition button. Let me add a semicolon. And now let's also, while we're here, let's import React, and let's do the import the state hook and the use effect hook. We're going to be using those in a second. All right, so we want to use the use state to create some local state. Wow, that is confusing. Let me show you an example. So say we want to have amount, and we'll do set amount. For those of you that are not familiar with React, so this is how it works. So this is using the use state. Basically, right here we put whatever value we want. So if we put this, then we know this is going to be a number. We can do a string, or we can do a object if we want, or we can even do a boolean. In this case, we're going to have amount be 0. And this is the function that we're going to be calling to set this value. So this is a variable. This is a function to set the value. That sets the value of this variable. This is how the use state works. Now let's add a description. All right, and description is going to be equal at the beginning to some description. So why don't we just create a list of descriptions? Descriptions equals to an array. Let's say we do groceries, credit card, student loans, I don't know, eating out, and say gas. You can put whatever you want. And now let's set the initial value to descriptions location 0. So these two will be used for whatever the user types, right? If they type whatever number for amount, we're going to be storing it here, and whatever description they pick, we're going to be storing it in the description, right? So back to the form, let's add the labels. Let's do description, and in form control, we can do as equals select, and let's do tab. New line. And then we're going to do on change. We're going to be setting this equals to the event, and then we're going to set that description. So description, the event, that target, that value. So whatever that value has, we're going to set the description to that value. All right, and let's close it right there. Oops. Okay, and in here we can have just the description that map, and we're going to show the list of option, and then we're just going to have AD, and there you go. So basically this will be like sort of like a drop down kind of thing. So on change, we're just going to set the description that they picked, and the options that they can pick are from this array, not descriptions, this array that we created up here. So whatever is in here is going to be displayed as an option. When they click on it, an event is going to get triggered, and set description is going to be set to whatever value, so whatever the user has clicked. Okay, so second label, we're going to have amount, and for this one we don't need to have two of these, so let's do that. There you go. And this guy is going to have a type of a number, and it's going to have a step of 0.01. That way it increments in 2 decimal places. And then we'll have a placeholder equals to the amount. And on change, we'll have an event. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set the amount based on the event at target that value. Just close that. I'll format this thing. Save it. We still haven't created this variable, so let's do that. Let's do const. Let's do is new expense, and then set is new expense. This is equals to use state, and we'll set it to true for the moment, and just leave it there. So for right now, it's always going to be true since this is not getting changed. And let's go ahead and update the form. So in here, what we want to do is do an onSubmit, do something about it. So we're going to get the event and do an event prevent default. This way, if we don't put this, the page will refresh, and we don't want it to refresh. So we're going to have that. And if is a new expense, we want to create a new expense, right? Else edit expense. So in here, we're going to end up having to call our service. So right now we don't have any methods in our service to create an expense. So we'll have to add that before we can finish this part right here. But for the moment, I just want to see the component itself. So let's go back to app.js and let's hook it up to see how it looks. Let's do an h3 and let's do new expense. Okay. And in here, we're going to do expense form. Cool. And let's add an h3 with style, and let's do border 1 pixel solid gray. And let's close this, and let's make sure we import this. So let's just copy this and do form, and make sure you change it on the back as well. And let's head over to the browser now and see if everything is working as we expect it to work. All right, so we'll pull out the browser and we can see the new expenses here, and we can click in any of these. We can pick gas or student loans. Say we enter some amount. Say we enter more than this amount of decimal places. It'll say two nearest valid values, right? So we have two decimal places, and obviously it doesn't add anything here because we haven't hooked that up yet, but at least it's showing the form, which is really nice. And this thing still is not working. So let's fix some of this stuff up. Let's make sure that whenever we click and we want to add a new expense, it actually adds it to your list of expenses. All right, so back to code. We're right here in the form. So this is the thing that the block of code that is going to get executed whenever we have a new expense, right? So this needs to call something because we need to make an HTTP request in order to create that new expense, right? So who's responsible for creating a new expense? Who's responsible for making that request? That is our services. So if we go back to expenses right here, then this guy is the one that is at the moment responsible of having our HTTP request. So let's create a new method here. Say we create, say we call it new expense. And let's wait asynchronous, and this will take a dispatch, and it will take an expense. And we'll do a try and catch here. And we'll console log error if we encounter any errors. And right here is where we're going to do our API call. For right now, we're going to pretend that we are retrieving that response already. So we're just going to straight dispatch the response. So it'll be action creators dot new expense, even though we don't have this yet. So we have to create this action. And we're going to return an ID of, I don't know, say 10. And the description will be the expense, that description. And we'll have a amount of the expense, that amount. So this object is going to be returned by it's going to be the response of our web API call. This is where we're going to get that ID. That ID is going to come from the web API because the database, whenever it creates that new entry in the table, is going to generate an ID, and then we're going to get that ID back. And then we're going to set this new object in our state. That way we have it. That way we don't have to recall get expenses again to get all the expenses, right? We know that we have a new expense. We can just add this new expense to our state, and that will save us one request. With that said, we have to go back to our expenses reducer and add this new action. So let's go back here, and we're going to be adding a new expense. New expense. Perfect. And right here, we're going to be doing a new expense. And this is going to take a payload. And it's going to be of type new expense. And we're going to have payload. Let me auto format that. And now we have to have a new case here. So case action types is of new expense. We want to return this object, which has state. And in here we're going to be overriding the expenses, and we'll have the action that payload, and we'll have state that expenses. All right, let me auto format that. So now we should have the action that it needs, right? Cool. With this in place, we can now go back to our form and finish it up. So right here, we're going to be creating that new expense call. Let me get rid of this. Okay, so we're going to be calling new expense, and we're going to be passing a dispatch, and we're going to be passing the expense itself. which is just a description and an amount. All right, so parentheses, semicolon, perfect. Save this, and we'll have to make sure you import this. It got automatically imported for me. And also we'll need a dispatch, so we need to import that. So we can do import use dispatch. Nope. Dispatch. That always happens. Sometimes, not always. React Redux. And we just want to have it here. It'll be const dispatch equals to use dispatch. And let's save that. Pull up your browser and let's do a quick test. So right here we have new expense. Say we do credit card and I paid 55 bucks. Press enter and we got credit card $55. Sweet. Let's add a $sign right here in front. It's one of the things to do. So eating out, $8.69. Nice. Okay, so the form seems to be working fine, and this little thing works as well. This is pretty cool. Let's make the edit buttons work, and let's add the $sign in front so that it looks nicer. All right, let's go back to the code. So back to the code, we're right here in expense list, and let's add a $sign right here in front of amount. Cool. And also let's start picking between what do we want to show on the list. Do we want to show the edit button, or do we want to show the edit row with the edit button, or do we want to show the expense form in order to edit that expense itself? So right here, what we can do is we can do like some variable saying if it's editing, and then we can do this thing or that thing. So if it is editing, we want to show the expense form, and we want to pass the expense in there, and we want to pass a function so that it toggles between editing and whenever it's done editing and whatnot. So we have to create this thing. So let's do a const. Okay, and then this will be equals to the use state, and we'll set that to false because at the beginning it would not be editing. So this is how it goes. If it's editing, it's going to show the expense form, and it's going to pass this expense into that component, and it's going to pass this function to set the editing, meaning if it hits cancel, if it hits save, this will have to toggle back to false, right? And if it's not editing, we're just going to show the normal thing that we were just seeing at the moment. So make sure we import the use state, and also we want to import expense form from expense form. And the last thing we have to do here is right here on the button itself, we want to toggle this on click. So we're going to do set is editing to not is editing. All right, save that file. And now let's head over to expense form, and let's update the way this thing is getting updated right now. And also let's add now the expense and is editing. All right, so now we're getting an expense and set is editing, right? So we want to use a use effect. Like I said, it takes a array, a function first, and then second parameter is an array. So we want this to run every time expense changes. Every time expense changes, we want to run this basically. So in case expense is not undefined, then we want to set is new expense to false. Else, we want to set this thing to true. Because if it is undefined, that means this is just a new expense, right? All right, and another thing we want to do here, if this is not undefined, we want to set the amount to whatever amount that expense has. So we'll just say expense amount. That way we can display properly in the placeholder the amount of the current expense. We can now scroll down, and right here, once we make the call to edit the expense, we can toggle this to set editing to false. Let's copy this. And also right here on the cancel button, we want to do an onClick. We want to do the same thing. Paste that in there and save that file. Now let's head over to the browser and check the updates. At the browser, we can see that we can edit, and this similar form as this one shows up with these buttons. And if we click cancel, it goes back. If we click save, it goes back to edit. And then if we change this, it's not going to save for now because we haven't have that feature yet included. And if we click edit, nothing happens. But let's do that next. Let's hit save and make this actually work. Let's go back to the code. So back at the code, there's one more thing I want to do real quick, style-wise. And it's just add a margin right of about 2 pixels. Let's add that to every button. And now let's go back to expense reducer, and we need 2 more actions. We need one for deleting an expense, and we need one to edit an expense. Delete expense is just going to delete that expense from our state, and edit an expense is going to basically update that expense in our state. All right, sounds good. So let's do it. So let's do edit expense, edit expense, and delete expense, delete expense. Okay. So this guy will be edit expense, and this will take a payload. And it's going to be a type action types that edit expense, and we're going to pass a payload. And this next one is going to be delete expense, and we're going to take a payload, and it's going to be of type action types that delete expense and payload. All right, let me auto format that. Sweet. Now let's go down here to our reducer, and we have to add 2 things. We have to add a case for the edit expense and a case for the delete expense. And the edit expense, all we got to do is find the ID and update the values for that, the description and the amount. And for the delete expense case, we're just going to remove that expense. Let's go ahead and add that case. Action types that edit expense. And right here, we're going to iterate through the array of expenses, and we're going to be looking for that ID. If we find the matching ID, we're just going to update the data. So let's do var expenses. So state that expenses that map expense. And right here, we'll do if expense dot ID is equal to action that payload dot ID, meaning the incoming expense. Then we'll set that expense to action that payload. And we're going to return the expense. There you go. Be sure not to confuse this guy with this guy. So we're comparing this ID with the expense passed in the action when we dispatch that action, and then we're setting that expense to that value itself, and we just return that expense at the end. And at the end, we just got to return our usual thing, state expenses, and right here, expenses. There you go. Next, let's do our case for the delete expense. So we can do action types that, there you go, delete expense. And what we want to do is we want to use a filter function, JavaScript, and what it does is it will just filter out that expense that we don't want. And we're going to check that via the ID. So if we see that ID, then we just don't want to add that to the new array. To the array we just that are just going to update the state with, right? So if you haven't checked this out, if you haven't used it yet, I'm about to show you. So expenses that, and then we'll do filter, and then we'll do expense. And since I didn't put curly brace, it's just going to return something. So I'll say return if the ID does not equal to action that payload that ID. So basically, this is the incoming expense. So as long as this ID doesn't match the ID of the rest of our expenses, then we're going to be returning all the expenses, right? And if it matches, it's just not going to return it. So that's our way to filtering out the expense we want to delete. And now at the end, we just do return state, and we do expenses, and right here we do expenses, auto format, and semicolon save. There you go. Now let's go back to our expenses in our services, and let's add two more functions, one for editing and one to delete. So export const edit expense equals to async. And right here, we want to get a dispatch, and we want to get an expense. All right, so inside, we're going to do a try and catch. And we'll do console.log error. And right here, we'll be making our API call whenever we have our API ready. And we're just going to be dispatching the action action creators. There you go. And we'll do edit expense, and we'll just dispatch that expense. We'll pass that payload, and okay, save that. All right, and we'll do a similar thing for delete expense. Sync dispatch expense. And right here, we'll do the try and catch. This is our API call. And then we're going to dispatch this action creators. There you go. Delete expense, and we'll pass expense. And we'll do the catch. Console.log error. All right, save that. Just to reiterate, Remember, delete expense, all it does is makes a call to the API and just says, hey, I want to delete this expense. We'll get a response. If we get a successful response, if we get a 200, then we'll just dispatch this action to delete the expenses on our side so that we don't have to recall our API to get all the expenses again. Since we know it was successful, we can just remove it in the front end. That will save one request. Same thing with edit expense. We'll make an API call. If that API call is successful, then we go ahead and update the expense in the front end. If it fails, then we won't be updating the expense in the front end. Just wanted to reiterate that just to make it clear for you guys. All we have left now is to go back to the form and just make the call and test our program. So let's go up here to the form, and right here we're calling new expense, but else we want to edit this expense, right? So we want to call the edit expense, and we're going to be passing the dispatch, and I'm going to copy this thing, paste it right here, and then we're going to pass that, but in addition we want to pass the expense.id. All right, save that. And then the other thing we got to do is right here on the delete button, we want to unclick, call the delete method we just created too. So delete expense, and we pass dispatch, and we pass the expense. All right, save that. And now make sure that this thing got imported. So I have edit expense, new expense, but I don't have the delete expense. All right, now save that. And let's go back to the browser and check if everything is working properly. All right, so we're back at the browser, and we can see that we can add a new expense. Cool. Let's do gas, $60. Cool. And then we can edit and we can cancel, and it stays as it is. Gas or student loans, $19.55, and it stays as it is when I cancel. Let's say we delete this now, and this thing stays open even though I didn't edit it. So let's fix that. And I did this to show you the importance of having a key when you're using the map function to render your components. So let's go back to your code and let's fix that. Back in the code, we're going to do a very simple but important addition right here. And it's just to have some kind of key so the render knows. So we'll do key. In this case, we can just use the expense ID, because that ID is unique. So you want a unique ID. And this is all we got to do. And now let's head back to the browser, and that problem should be gone. So back at the browser, we can click edit, and we can delete this, and this stay not open. So it stay closed. So this is awesome. That fixed it. Okay, so the delete worked, by the way. That's good news. Let's add something here. Let's say $100. And we add that. And we have $100. And if we click right here, the Redux of DevTools, and we go to Actions, and we can see that the first thing that happened was, like we saw, all the expenses got set. Then we deleted this thing, which shows groceries, and this 2316 ID of 1. And then we add a new expense, which has an ID of 10. And this ID right now, we have a hard-coded ID. Remember, whenever we make our real web API call, we'll have an ID populated for us. So, and now let's edit something. So say we did not spend $18.52 on gas, and we actually meant to put say credit card and $30.32. And we save, and now that's saved. If we go back here, we can see that this thing got updated. Our state got updated as well. Cool. Let's do another edit. Instead of 600, let's say 6,000. and student loans. And we can even hit enter. There you go. And it got updated. Cool. One thing to point out is that if we add multiple things with the same ID, since we're hard coding this to ID 10 and this to ID 10 as well, let's do like 3 of these, and we try to edit this, then all of them are going to get updated because they all have the same ID. At least this 3 have the same ID. And then if we try to delete one of these, the rest are going to kind of crash. And this is because the map function doesn't have a unique ID for each of these. So keep that in mind. And this is going to get fixed once we make our web API call, because that is going to give us a unique ID per expense. And with this, we have finished this part of the application. On the next part, we're going to be building our web API and our database and doing first migration and making sure that the web API can, talk to database and all that stuff. So that's going to be really, really cool. And the third part, we're going to be integrating the front end and our back end to make sure that the application is fully working. And that's it. If you have any other questions, if you have any questions at all, just drop in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, please like this video and subscribe. It will really help me out. And also make sure that you don't miss any other videos that I'll be putting out. Remember, to get better at something, you have to study and you have to practice. So make sure you practice, you put in that work. But on top of all, make sure you have fun while coding. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.